Welcome to the history of English. Today, English is a gigantic language. It is spoken by more than 1 billion people, and according to the Global Language Monitor, it contains more than 1 million words, which in some people's view is more than any other language in the world. You could also claim that English is a bit of a messy language. Different words and speech sounds sound different in different places. Jamaican English is so different from the English spoken in New York, Birmingham, Dublin or New Delhi, India. Also, you could claim that the spelling is messy as it's strange and unpredictable. For example, why are all these words that are spelled the same way pronounced differently? Through, cough, though, rough and bow. Was there ever a time when English was a simple language, spoken by one people with one word for everything and logical spelling? I like ice cream. Me too. Well, not really. In fact, the story of English is a story about the mixing of different people and their languages. So the reason why the English language contains so many words is that all those different peoples have all put their words into the English vocabulary. And one reason why the spelling is so unpredictable is that these different languages that made up English spell in different ways and use different spelling principles. So cow is spelled according to other principles than sergeant, for example. Another reason is that the pronunciation of speech sounds have changed during the century, but the spelling has not really followed. The Viking here might have said knife. We don't say it, we say knife, but we still spell it like the Viking did. Strange. But without further ado, let's step back in time to the very beginning, to the Celts and the Romans. Before anything reminiscent of English was spoken on the British Isles, there were the Celts who spoke Celtic. In 43, they were invaded by the Romans. That was not all bad, however, because firstly, the Romans protected the Celts from all those violent tribes in Europe at the time. And secondly, the Romans gave us the word for Britain, Britannica, which is good to know. However, the Romans were called back in 410 because they had to Rome, because they had to defend Rome when the empire was doing worse. So then the Romans left, actually. And we're at part 2 now, the Anglo-Saxons and Old English. When the Romans no longer stopped them, several tribes from northern Europe and Denmark started to invade Britain. The groups were called Angles, Saxons, Frisians and Jutes. They spoke different languages that were reminiscent of each other. When these languages were mixed together, we got Old English. What then happened to Celtic and Latin, the language that the Romans spoke? Well, the Celtic language actually died down. We haven't got that many Celtic words in English anymore at all. But with Latin, it's a whole different story. Like English all over the world today, Latin has had a high status through history. So just like we Swedes tend to use English words when we want to seem smart, the English have imported several Latin words to English all through history. I'll now talk a little bit about Old English. As I said, Old English was spoken by the Angles, Saxons, Frisians and Jutes. All these groups that came to England and were mixed now are now called Anglo-Saxons. Old English is of course very different from the English of today, even though many words are still the same. To the Swedes, it's interesting to know that English and Swedish has a bit of a common background. They're both so-called Germanic languages. And some of the early words for those days have been kept in Swedish, whereas they've disappeared in English. Let's take a look at this, for example. As a Swede, there might be a higher chance that you understand these words, these Old English words, than it would be for an Englishman, just because we've kept our Germanic, our same language. See if you can guess what these words are called in English today. Uppgång, tid, jorth, fugol, and utgång. Well, uppgång is rise, tid is time, jorth is earth, fugol is bird, and utgång is exit. Well done! In those days, the speech sounds of Old English were more like ours in Sweden as well. The letter Y was, for example, pronounced Y, and you could say K before N. So the words that is spelled no could be pronounced as kno. So to summarize, now we've talked about the first invasion that really affected the English language, that of the Anglo-Saxons. Now we will go on to the second invasion. Which was it, do you think? Well, you were right, the Vikings. From year 800 and onwards, the Vikings started to raid the east coast and gradually they took control over bigger and bigger parts. The Vikings came from Denmark and Norway and spoke Old Norse. And Old Norse is a Germanic language, so the languages Old English and Old Norse were similar but yet different. Also, Old Norse was a language spoken in all of Scandinavia and Sweden as well at the time. Okay. What happened to the English vocabulary when Old Norse came? Well, when people mix, languages tend to mix as well. So let us see what happened when there were two words for something, one in Old English and one in Old Norse. Which one survived? Well, that depends. Let's see here, for example. Here, the Viking says sister and the Anglo-Saxon says swester. Which one survived? Well, of course, the Viking word sister. Go Vikings! So in some cases, the Old Norse word survived, and in other cases, the Old English word survived. But, and this is important, in many cases, both terms survived. They have become synonyms, or they have come to mean slightly different things. Take these words, for example. The Anglo-Saxon said ill, whereas the Vikings said sick. From Anglo-Saxon came the word rise, and from the Vikings came the word raise. Now, these are near synonyms, but they don't actually mean the same thing. Think about for a while what these words actually mean. The positive here is that these different words and these different synonyms have helped enrich the English language, making it bigger and richer in synonym. So just like I said in the beginning, the English language has really grown through the mixing of languages. It could also be interesting to notice that in Scotland, where the Vikings were dominant for a long time, they have some dialect words heavily influenced by Old Norse. What would you, as a Scandinavian, guess that kirk means, for example? That's right, church. What would you guess that barn means? That's correct, child. Okay. Now it's time for part 3, the Normans and Middle English. Well, the third and last invasion of the British Isles that has deeply affected the language is what is known as the Norman Conquest. In 1066, England was invaded by a group of people from Normandy, now northern France, and their Duke William became King William I in England. King William was an excellent administrator who gave all the powerful positions in his kingdom to his Norman friends. Thus, the French dialect that the Normans spoke became the language of the powerful, the posh people. In those days, not much was written in English anymore. All documents were in French. If you wanted power, you spoke French. French had a high status. How did that affect the English vocabulary? Well, all new words started to flood in. But what type of words? As the Normans were posh people, they brought all their fancy stuff with them and words for that. Words like diamond, dress, biscuit, park, poet, crown, empire, etc. Since they established a court system, there are also a great many words about law and crime, such as convict or convict, crime, prison, and punishment, and many other words. But the Anglo-Saxons were farmers, simple people, and the Anglo-Saxon words for things around them were kept, like swine, cow, mill, arse, and snot, etc. So the Anglo-Saxon and the French words belong to different areas in life. Sometimes, however, the words overlapped, like in the case of Old English and Old Norse that we talked about before. There were not two words, one from Anglo-Saxon and one from French, that survived that meant the same thing, but both words survived and became synonyms. While you said loving in Old English, for example, you could now also say amorous instead. And it seems like amorous sounds more posh than loving, doesn't it? Those differences in synonym and style has lived on since the time of the Anglo-Saxon and French time, when the French were considered more posh. Here are a number of synonyms: vision, sight, breakable, fragile, beverage, drink, shit, defecate. Which of these words do you believe are French in origin and which are Anglo-Saxon? Have a guess. Well, sight, Anglo-Saxon, is the same as vision, French. Breakable, Anglo-Saxon, is the same as fragile, French. Drink, Anglo-Saxon, same as beverage, French. And shit, Anglo-Saxon, is the same as defecate, French. Again, the French word sounds posh and the Anglo-Saxon word sounds more everyday, okay, less formal. Well, because by this time the spelling started to become really confusing. And one reason was that people started to speak differently in some parts of the country, but they didn't change the pronunciation. And another reason, of course, was that all these new French words were spelled according to totally different principles. And of course, it was very confusing. To sum up, we've talked about 3 invasions of the British Isles that have deeply affected the language of English. First the Anglo-Saxons that kind of founded English, then the Vikings, and then the Normans. Since then, no one has managed to invade Britain. On the contrary, Britain has toured the world creating the British Empire. But naturally, this has deeply affected the English language as well. In all these different parts of the world, English has evolved in a specific direction and new dialects have been formed. Also, in all these parts of the world, new things have been discovered and the words for those things have enriched the English language. An example is how new words have formed is in the US. When early settlers came to the US in 1620 and onwards, they discovered plants and animals that they had never seen before and had to name them. They found all these new other things that need a name. So they saw a plant that looked like an egg. Let's call it eggplant. They saw a fish with whiskers like a cat. Well, then they called it catfish. They found something that looked like a nut in a pea pod, so they called it a peanut. And they also borrowed words from Native Americans, such as moccasin and moose. Some words are spelled different in the US and Britain today. There are different reasons for that. One example is the crop maize, which is called corn in the US. Well, the reason is that originally corn is the word for the dominant seed in a country. In England, it was wheat that sometimes was called corn because that was the most important, most common corn. But in America, it was maize that became the most powerful and most common crop. So they called it corn. There are other changes in vocabulary where the English, and sometimes when you see words that are different in English in America, depends that the American has kept the traditional form that the English used to have, but the English have changed it. Like the word fall, for example. In the old days, they said fall in England for autumn, but England changed it to autumn, but the Americans didn't. It's the same with candy, an old word for sweets in English. The English had changed the word to sweets, but the Americans kept the traditional form from the first English settlers. And today we find many differences in vocabulary between American and English. It's not so strange. When a language is spread over the world, it tends to diverge, it tends to become different in different places. So see if you can notice some differences in what these words mean here. We're about to finish now, and I just want to say that English has changed throughout history and it's going to continue to change. Thank you very much for listening, and bye bye.